Hi, and welcome back to my channel. Let's talk about something personal. I'm AuDHD, which means I have been clinically diagnosed with autism and ADHD. I'm late diagnosed as an adult, which is really common for women, and I want to talk to you about my AuDHD, my diagnosis process, my experiences with being AuDHD. And first of all, it's important to note that these are my experiences living in Germany, and also they are my personal experiences that are individual and don't represent how it is generally done in Germany in every case. We still have a lot of room for improvement, but it's also not all bad. So just a little disclaimer before anyone comments, but it wasn't like that for me, so you are wrong. So this is a very personal experience. Let's start with my childhood. And my childhood was different from other children, which I didn't know at this point, because I didn't have a lot of friends as a child to compare myself. But the older I got, the more I realized how unusual it was. In kindergarten, I barely made friends, but I was stuck in the room's back book corner, and when the kindergarten set up a fish tank with tadpoles to teach us how frogs grow from egg to frog, I sat there for hours at the tank and just observed them. When we had outside activities, I was overloaded. I would stand outside and rather watch others than involve myself in the play, because it always included kids screaming and running. But I would also have my outbursts when I was pushed to my limits. They would happen rarely, but when they did, it was strong. Today, I know those were meltdowns, but as a child, they were framed as temper tantrums, and I was punished and yelled at for having them, which, of course, didn't help a lot. And I think a lot of late diagnosed people in my age can probably relate to that experience. As a teenager, I was considered an introvert with a tendency to not wanting to fulfill expectations, while at the same time very much relying on rules religiously. And to be honest, I'm still the same. I accept the rules that I see as useful and rebel against the rest. I was in the goth scene from a very young age, on maybe 14, and this was probably the peak time I noticed how different my life was from other kids in my school. And later, when I was an adult, I realized why I felt so comfortable in the goth scene, because I was face blind. And that means people who looked normal and mainstream didn't appear like individual people to me, but rather like a genre of people. I would confuse them with each other, and I had problems to really get invested into their lives because I couldn't differentiate them from all the other people that just looked the same. And this was something I did subconsciously. I didn't know about face blindness at that age. I didn't know that it was a thing. And I was basically just coping the best I could and being part of the alternative scene in which people looked very individual with hair colors, clothing, tattoos, and piercings. It was so much easier for me to see them as different people. On top of the disabilities I have and now know about, I also had a very dysfunctional childhood home, which didn't help me at all, but made many things even worse. I think it was one of the main reasons my issues were not seen as a disability, but rather as an annoyance, and more like a lack of discipline. I was also the middle child, and all of the things said about middle children are true. My older sister is also heavily disabled, so when my little sister was born, I became overlooked between the older disabled sister and the little cute one. I was expected to function, and I was expected to be healthy, responsible, and invisible. And I almost broke under that pressure that was put on me when I was barely 5 years old. When I was in my 20s, a former boyfriend who was diagnosed with ADHD himself told me that my behavior reminded him of an autistic coworker he had. At the time, I was almost sure that I had ADHD myself, but autism had never been on my radar at all until he mentioned it. Mainly because of the poor media representation, also how autism was portrayed in education, like in school. It was exclusively shown as nonverbal, drooling kids that seemed to not notice their surroundings, or kids just being overly aggressive. And I never saw myself there. But when he mentioned it, I did what everyone with autism would do, and I went to the library reading up upon autism, especially in adults and in women. And honestly, I was mind blown. I took my phone and photographed the sections that were written as if they described me. I personally felt targeted and understood in the best way possible. The good parts of me, but also the bad parts, were described in those books, and that was the moment where I was convinced that is it. Despite thinking AuDHD might still be a thing, I pushed it away in favor for the autism diagnosis. ADHD still had a reputation where I feared, especially seeing the things my ex-boyfriend struggled with, I wouldn't be taken serious without having someone on my side fighting with me for the right of a diagnosis and treatment. Naive me thought about the autism, hey, I go to a doctor, they test it, and then I have the answer. And no, it's not like that. I didn't have a lot of online resources where autistic people talked about their experiences, and it was rare back then and fairly unheard of. So I went to my GP, told her about my issue, and she was very understanding and sweet and supportive and agreed that it sounds very likely to be the case with me. And she would send me to a neurologist for further treatment and diagnostic. So I held this recommendation in my hands and I thought to myself, so yay, that was pretty smooth and easy. Unfortunately, that is where smooth and easy stopped. 4 weeks later, I sat at the neurologist in his treatment room, told him in detail why I thought I might be autistic. I gave him a longer list of things I had written down that fit into the diagnostic criteria and asked him for advice, how to proceed with a diagnosis and how to get help and support. There was this awkward pause of silence after I spoke, and then he looked at me and he laughed and said, "Who put this nonsense into your head that you could be autistic? First of all, you don't look autistic, and if you were, you wouldn't be able to talk to me. We're just wasting our time here. You just seem to be burned out and depressed, and I will prescribe you some antidepressants and tranquilizers that should help you get through your day." And I went home, disappointed. I took the antidepressant and tranquilizers like I was told, and I became really sick. They didn't improve any of my problems, but they just created more. So I went back telling him my symptoms. And in the next 2 months, he would prescribe me 3 more antidepressants before giving up, saying I couldn't be treated and I just had to live with it. And there I was, I had gained weight from the medication, I started to lose my hair, and I would vomit after certain foods and still had the same problems I went to the doctor with in the first place. And then a few years would pass until I was brave enough to look into it again. And aside from brave, also desperate, because many things in my life didn't work anymore. I couldn't function anymore. Even the most basic things took all my energy from me. So I moved cities as I didn't expect to find help in my small hometown, and I moved into a bigger city. I was alone and all by myself, and it took a few years to get sorted and organized. My problems didn't disappear with my move, but they just looked different. They shifted, and it was probably the worst time of my life looking back. But again, the wish to persist dominated, and I crawled out of my hole and I contacted several places for an appointment for a diagnosis. And then it happened. I got put on a waiting list for an autism diagnosis. I was told it would take at least 2 years, if not longer, to finally get the appointment to get diagnosed. And I also knew at that point that the ADHD part was probably the one that made me the most issues. But since there was basically no help or support for people with ADHD, and especially no way to get diagnosed, I again preferred to let the autism get checked out first, because I had to start somewhere. Something I experienced a lot was kind of an imposter syndrome, the doubt if I am really autistic or if I maybe just try to make excuses for myself for being the terrible person. Part of it was the background having a troubled childhood where a lot of my issues were explained by me not being disciplined enough. But then especially online, I read a lot that real autistic people would know without a doubt if they are autistic or not, even without a diagnosis. But I doubted myself all the time. Sometimes I thought that I maybe should give up my spot in the waiting line for someone who's really autistic. You know, those who knew 100% they were. But then I had moments where I just even laughed about how I could even doubt myself. It came in waves, and this is why I'm now very vocal about how different the experience can be for people. Not everything you hear online is true, because people love to take their own experiences and make it a rule for something. And sometimes I think that's maybe also part of the autism to do that. Like the need to live within the rules, and by making your own experience a rule, it's accommodating for that. But it is, after all, a personal experience and not a rule, and it will vary wildly. The day of the autism assessment was hard for many different reasons, and I was nervous like I had to write an exam in university. I tried to mentally prepare myself for what I would do and think and feel if I wasn't autistic, but if I was just the lazy, terrible person. And the assessment itself was not super long. I had to fill out some tests, I had to do a focus and a memory test, an IQ test. But in the end, the doctor told me I was one of the clearest cases he had seen in a while, especially because I was a woman. Also, his final report said this very clearly, and my imposter syndrome was silenced. Finally. By the way, also a misinformation you will see online. I got diagnosed with Asperger autism, and this is a term that is generally not used anymore, as the autism diagnosis has been restructured and reorganized. But people can and will still get the diagnosis if that's the diagnostic manual that is used. And that diagnosis was actually again renewed this year, so people will still get the diagnosis. How you refer to yourself, it's up to you, but it is still something that will be on paperwork. The waiting time for the autism diagnosis took 2.5 years in total for being covered by public health insurance, so I didn't have to pay for anything for getting diagnosed. And I think these waiting times are still normal right now, maybe they're even a bit longer at the moment. And in the area here, the places that actually are allowed to diagnose are getting overrun, and some even closed, and sometimes it's just one person in a whole hospital that is qualified. And if they leave or retire, then there's no way to get a diagnosis unless they find a new person. At the point, I finally was able to get help and assistance for my autism. There are different ways of helping autistic people here in Germany. Those ways are not available everywhere, and the education of the people helping can vary a lot. That means the qualifications just depend on who is going to help you. There's no standard to it. And the help that was the most important for me personally was getting an assistant that I would meet up regularly to battle bureaucracy monsters and any outside chores and errands in which I could overload or that would take away energy for other things. Because the goal is to live relatively normal, but have support in situations where I would either avoid doing things or I would do them and then have no energy left for doing anything else. Because in reality, autism, or in my case AuDHD, is having to do 5 things every week, and you only have the energy for 3. But all 5 things are crucial and important, so you start building up either energy debt by doing more than you can just to keep up with it, or you build up task debt, which can ultimately either cost your livelihood or your well-being. With an assistant, these tasks don't go away, of course, but they maybe just cost the energy of 3/4 of a task. So while I won't get everything done the way I wanted, I don't have to risk my health or my livelihood to the extent I would otherwise have to. And the assistance doesn't cost me anything and is paid by. There are some lengthy and annoying mechanics connected with it for getting it paid that make the barrier a little higher to overcome to get access. But once you have it, it's fairly smooth sailing. Now, ADHD. How did this diagnosis happen? Actually, just this year. Almost 8 years after my autism diagnosis. And why did it take so long? In between my autism diagnosis and my ADHD diagnosis, I had 2 years of trauma therapy because of things happening to me in my childhood and also things during and after my move to the new city. I chose therapy over approaching another diagnosis yet because I read up on ADHD diagnosis and how it is actually harder to get than the autism one, and you are quicker denied if anything else had happened to you in your life. And my trauma could have been a good reason to not get diagnosed at all. So for me, it was important to get this out of the way so I could be sure that my symptoms were autism and ADHD and not PTSD and CPTSD. And on top that time, the diagnosis possibilities were still terrible here. The reason was the health insurance required a computer-based diagnosis, so they wanted to do a reaction test. So you had to do the reaction test on a computer in the practice in order to get diagnosed. But the setup and the license for this testing software were so expensive that practices that were qualified to diagnose ADHD just couldn't afford it. And that limited it to the places that had a lot of money to afford this and that also had someone with the right qualification. Again, often just one doctor was qualified in a whole hospital. After my 2 years of therapy and 1 year after in which I worked on myself, a phase of finding myself as a person again and defining who I was, my therapist emailed me and said the health insurance finally lifted the requirement of doing the reaction test because studies found out that this computer-based testing doesn't make a difference in diagnosing and that qualified therapists and doctors can find ADHD still reliable even without this extra data set. She then also offered me to get diagnosed with her, and this message was big because she knew me. She knew my history, my mental growth during the time, and I didn't have to be scared to be sent away because of my trauma past. And I also didn't have to explain myself yet again to someone new. So I filled out all of the paperwork, had my family also fill out some papers, and then had my appointment with her, where she did an interview with me, and after that she told me to get an appointment with a doctor if I wanted medication. And this is where I'm now, with an older autism diagnosis, a fresh AuDHD diagnosis many years later. So let's talk about the experiences I have made as a disabled person with AuDHD. First of all, yes, it's a disability. It is restricting me to live in this world as it is. And if you now want to see the disability or the world, how it is right now as the disabling part, is up to you, because I cannot afford mindset games too much how a perfect society for my disability would look like. So I wouldn't feel disabled, because I need to live in this world as it is. And I cannot wait until someone changes it, because realistically and also historically, it was never the world that was changed, but how we dealt with disabled people when problems occurred. And without sounding too negative, I doubt it will get better or even stay the way it is right now. But, and this is very important and also something that I can say I have gained through my years of therapy, I don't hate my autism and I don't hate my ADHD, because they are not an attachment to my person. They are not just something extra that I have, but they are two very defining character building factors. Both of them make me who I am. They shape my personality, my interests, my obsessions, my dislikes, and without them, I wouldn't be me. And I don't even think I would like myself that much if those things were taken away from me. There are these very heated discussions online about calling autism a superpower, and I personally define it like that for myself in some categories, not overly. But mainly it's because I know a superpower always comes with a sacrifice, your kryptonite basically, in order for you to have this superpower. Superpowers have never been only a good thing and a positive thing, but they always came at the cost that would have others consider if they even wanted to have one. And while people respect and envy me for my skills that are clearly only possible due to my hyperfixation and my hyperfocus that comes with my AuDHD, I pay my price for that, the brain fog, the not functioning most of the time. I do have my moments where I outshine most people, and these moments for me are valuable enough to not want to be neurotypical without my neurodiversity. I know the standpoint is very controversial, but calling autism and ADHD only terrible and bad and negative comes from the misconception how diagnosis works. People who have the opinion that it's only a negative thing look at the diagnostic criteria and say, well, there is nothing positive on there, therefore there is nothing positive about it. And this is not true, but it's not understanding how diagnostic works. In order to get diagnosed with something, there has to be a degree of suffering. Nobody gets diagnosed for feeling amazing. Nobody gets diagnosed for overachieving in their job. Like, I wouldn't get diagnosed for my research skills. So the parts of ADHD and autism that are important for diagnosis are the parts that make you suffer, not the parts that might make you more productive. And it's really important to understand this difference, because while the suffering part is the only relevant part for the diagnosis, it's not the only way autism and ADHD shows in people. It's not the only symptoms, because as I mentioned earlier, both are character defining. They decide on what you like, who you are, who you like, and your diagnosis should never be a reason for self-hatred, because that would be the consequence of seeing it as an only negative thing, self-hatred. You are still autistic and you still have ADHD when you love yourself and you admire the parts about yourself that are boosted by your autism and ADHD. Things aren't black and white. Your strengths don't disappear just because you have deficits somewhere else. But unfortunately, there is a lot of internalized ableism, the hate of their own disability within the disabled community. People who think that admitting to the good parts will nullify the bad parts and they don't deserve to be called disabled then, but who also measure other disabled people by these standards. The amount of people who try to tell me my diagnosis isn't valid because I hyper-focus on writing and research and I love that about myself, that's unfortunately too high to ignore. Often their mindset is like this because they experience no support for their disability, and instead of hating and fighting the system that neglects them, they hate and fight each other, and especially those who thrive and who have the support they would also like to have. I do understand the reasons, but I also think it's dangerous to drive people into self-hate, especially when our society is getting more and more hostile towards us. We just have to look at the political situation right now, especially when it comes to autism. And we don't need that mindset within our community either. But I, for myself, need to stay away from the gatekeeping and the tone policing, because I think it's harmful for those who are still in the process of finding answers for themselves. Just because our path went through self-hate, depression, and anxiety, it doesn't need to be the same way for everyone. Being positive-minded doesn't mean that you're not allowed to complain when stuff goes wrong. It's not toxic positivity, because, I complain all the time. I have my moments where I wish my disability wasn't there for that exact thing I needed to do, but it doesn't mean that you question if you should exist at all when stuff goes downhill. The positive mindset is for keeping your base happiness. That makes it easier for you to recover from catastrophes. And this is something that therapy helped me to understand. Looking past the black and white thinking, looking past the identity of eternal suffering from a disability and seeing my life with new eyes. Accepting the things that disable me and finding my way to be happy despite them. My future will now be to find a doctor to prescribe me medication for my ADHD, testing it if it's for me. And this is another hurdle to master, as many doctors deny to prescribe them, and there are still waiting times of several months even to find one. But in comparison to my previous barriers, this actually seems manageable, and I can realistically be done with it this year. And now you know how things went for me. Not without problems, not immediately, but at least for free. I did consider going private and pay for an ADHD diagnosis at some point, because it felt impossible to even get it otherwise. But that diagnosis wouldn't have been accepted by my health insurance, and in the end, I would have had it quicker, but I wouldn't have been able to properly use it. So I'm glad this eventually worked out the way it did, with a lot of luck and coincidences that helped me on my way. If you want to tell me your story, how it went for you, or if you didn't get diagnosed yet, what struggles you have about it, please tell me in the comments. I'm curious about your experiences. And thank you for listening to this very long and very personal report of my diagnostic journey. If you like videos in which I'm talking about societal issues and problems, feel free to subscribe here. I have 2 more videos I'm working on right now, so there will be more 3 a.m. thoughts for you.